Welcome back for another deep dive. You know, when you think about Martin Luther King Jr., I bet that "I have a dream" speech is what pops into your head
Oh,
first.
for sure. An iconic speech.
Yeah, but there's so much more to the man and his story, and we're going to try and uncover some of that today.
Looking forward to it.
We're diving into Jonathan Igg's biography of MLK.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating stuff, and it gives you a really personal and nuanced look at his life.
It really goes beyond the typical narrative,
Yeah.
It's really well researched.
Exactly. And you know what really struck me was how much his early life in the segregated South, shaped him.
Right.
Ike paints a really vivid picture of what it was like growing up Black in that era. And
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that really highlights that economic injustice of segregation is the story of MLK's mother
oh, yeah.
having to trace his foot on a newspaper to buy shoes
Wow.
because they weren't allowed to try them on in white-owned stores.
I mean, it's hard to even imagine something like that today.
Really is.
It's just, and it really makes you think about the systemic nature of discrimination, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about separate water fountains. It was about limiting opportunities
Yeah.
and keeping entire communities trapped in poverty.
Absolutely. And you see how that early exposure to economic inequality influenced MLK's later activism.
Yeah.
Right? He understood that true equality meant addressing not just legal segregation, but also those deep-rooted economic disparities that held Black people back.
Yeah, it wasn't just about changing the laws. It was about changing
Yeah, the whole system.
the system. Yeah, and it's amazing how something as simple as buying shoes
Right.
can become such a powerful symbol.
Yeah.
And speaking of influences, both of MLK's parents were really strong figures,
Yeah.
but in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
His father, Daddy King, was known for his powerful presence and his sometimes fiery temper.
It's a very strong personality.
But his mother, Alberta, instilled in him the importance of love, pacifism, and the sweetness of religion, as Ike puts it.
It's fascinating to see how those contrasting influences really shaped MLK's personality and his leadership style, right? He inherited his father's strength and charisma, but also embraced his mother's deep faith and commitment to nonviolence.
Yeah. And it's that.
And that tension between forceful action and pacifism would become a recurring theme throughout his life.
Yeah, that tension between those two things is fascinating. And speaking of those early experiences, there's this particularly poignant story about MLK's first encounter with racism as a child,
Ooh, yeah.
when his white playmates suddenly stopped playing with him when they realized he was Black.
That moment, as simple as it may seem, really speaks volumes about the psychological impact of segregation on young minds.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that racism doesn't just create separate societies,
Right.
but it really inflicts these deep personal wounds.
And it makes you realize that MLK's later work wasn't just about changing laws and policies,
Right,
but
yeah.
also about healing those psychological scars left by generations of discrimination.
Right, it was about restoring dignity and a sense of shared humanity.
Exactly. Now, this might surprise you, but MLK wasn't always set on becoming a preacher.
Oh, really?
He actually considered other paths like medicine and law.
That is interesting what ultimately drew him to ministry.
Well, it seems like a summer preaching in Connecticut really solidified his calling.
Okay.
It was like all the pieces suddenly fell into place.
That's a feeling a lot of people can probably relate to, right? Finding your true purpose.
Yeah.
But what's really remarkable is that MLK found his calling in service to others, in fighting for justice and equality. And that commitment shaped everything he did.
Yeah, it's like that experience gave him the clarity and the conviction he needed to take on the challenges that lay ahead. And speaking of taking on challenges, we can't talk about MLK without talking about the influence of Gandhi on his philosophy.
Absolutely.
Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance was a revelation for MLK.
Yeah.
It gave him a framework for fighting injustice without resorting to violence.
Yeah, a powerful idea.
What's fascinating is that it was actually a lecture by Howard University president Mordecai Johnson
Oh.
that sparked MLK's deep dive into Gandhi's writings. It's amazing how seemingly random events can have such a profound impact.
It really highlights the power of ideas
Yeah.
and how they can spread and inspire action.
Yeah.
Gandhi provided MLK with the practical and moral tools that he needed to lead a movement for social change.
And that brings us to Montgomery, Alabama in 1955.
Okay.
The arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her bus seat.
Right.
It's a moment everyone knows, but what's often overlooked is the complex web of Jim Crow laws
Yeah.
that made segregation on buses such an ingrained part of Southern life.
Those laws were designed to systematically dehumanize and control black people.
Yeah,
They weren't just about separate seats.
right.
They were about reinforcing white supremacy in every aspect of daily life.
It's mind-boggling to think that this was just a few decades ago.
It really is.
And what's interesting is that E.D. Nixon, a local activist,
Yeah.
specifically chose MLK to lead the bus boycott. Really?
Because he was new in town
Okay.
and hadn't made any enemies yet.
That was a brilliant strategic move.
Yeah.
They needed someone with a strong moral voice, but who wasn't already embroiled in local politics.
Right.
It shows how much careful planning went into launching the movement.
Talk about being thrown into the fire.
Yeah,
Imagine the pressure of leading a movement of that magnitude at such a young age,
yeah.
with death threats and even a bombing of his home.
It's incredible to think about the courage it took to face that kind of danger and hostility.
Yeah.
He had to be a symbol of strength and resilience for the movement while also dealing with very real fear and doubt.
Yeah.
It humanizes him in a way that makes his achievements even more remarkable.
It reminds us that even the most iconic figures are human,
Yeah,
facing the same anxieties and uncertainties as the rest of us.
absolutely. It really is amazing how he was able to project that strength while dealing with his own struggles, you know?
Yeah.
Egg's biography does a great job of going into that side of him. Yeah, it makes him much more relatable.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that comes through is that complicated relationship he had with his father, Daddy King,
Right.
You sense this admiration, but also this need to kind of break free
Yeah.
from his father's very large shadow.
Definitely. It's that classic dynamic of a son trying to live up to his father's legacy, but also forge his own path.
Right. And remember, Daddy King was a prominent figure in the Black church.
Oh, yeah.
So MLK was stepping into some pretty big shoes.
Huge shoes.
It makes you wonder how those expectations shaped his approach to leadership.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he was deeply rooted in those traditions of the Black church, but he was also pushing for a more progressive, even radical approach to social change.
And then there's his relationship with Coretta Scott King,
Yeah.
which gets a lot of attention in the biography.
Right.
She was so much more than just a supportive wife. I mean,
Yeah.
she was an activist in her own right, deeply involved in the movement.
Their partnership was truly remarkable. Coretta was intelligent, ambitious, and had this deep commitment to social justice.
Yeah.
She really challenged. MLK pushed him to think differently and played a vital role in shaping his vision.
I was particularly struck by the detail about how, MLK made it clear that he expected his wife to be waiting for him when he came home from work,
Oh, really?
which seems a bit at odds with his progressive views.
That's a good point. It kind of highlights those societal pressures and expectations that they faced even within the movement itself.
Right.
There were still those traditional gender roles that were hard to break free from, even as they were fighting for equality.
Yeah, it just shows how deeply ingrained those ideas were.
It really does.
But even with those expectations, Coretta was a force to be reckoned with.
Oh, absolutely. She was a leader in her own right and continued to be a powerful voice for justice long after MLK's death.
Okay, so we've talked about MLK's personal life, his influences, and how he came to lead the movement, but I'm curious about the tactics he used. He was clearly a master strategist, always thinking several steps ahead.
Oh, you're absolutely right. He understood the power of nonviolent resistance, not just as this moral principle, but as a way to expose the brutality of the opposition.
And he famously said,
He famously said, "Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time."
and he wasn't afraid to get arrested to fill up the jails,
Yeah.
to put pressure on the system.
Exactly. He knew that those acts of civil disobedience, those moments of confrontation, were crucial to forcing change.
And he was brilliant at using the media
Oh, yeah.
to amplify the movement's message.
Well, I quotes Gunnar Myrdal, who said, "To get publicity is of the highest importance."
Right.
MLK understood the power of images to sway public opinion.
Yeah, turning the cameras on the violence inflicted upon peaceful protesters was a key part of his strategy.
It was brilliant. He knew that seeing those images of police brutality of dogs attacking peaceful protesters would shock the conscience of America and force people to confront the reality of segregation.
And it worked.
It did.
Those images galvanized support for the movement and put pressure on politicians to act.
Yeah, he knew how to leverage public sentiment to achieve political change.
But it wasn't just about tactics.
Right.
He also had this incredible ability to inspire.
Yeah,
to move people with his words.
absolutely.
His speeches were more than just political rhetoric. They were
Yeah.
like sermons filled with passion, conviction, and a deep understanding of human nature.
His words resonated with people from all walks of life.
Yeah.
Lines like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. From his letter from Birmingham jail, transcend time and place.
Yeah, they still resonate today, even in a completely different context.
They have a timeless quality because they speak to something fundamental about the human spirit,
Right.
our need for dignity and respect.
But there was also a strategic element to his communication,
Oh, yeah.
like a carefully crafted image that he projected to the world.
Right. MLK understood that in order to win over hearts and minds, he had to challenge those stereotypes and prejudices that many white Americans held about black people.
Okay, so he was consciously using his platform to reshape the image of black leadership.
Absolutely. And it was incredibly effective by presenting himself in a way that challenged those stereotypes.
Right.
He made it harder for people to dismiss him as an angry radical.
Right.
He forced them to listen to his message, to see him as a human being worthy of respect.
It's a brilliant strategy, and it makes his achievements even more impressive. But let's be real, he wasn't universally loved, was he?
That's true.
Even within the black community, there were disagreements about his approach.
Yeah, there were those who felt he was too accommodating, too willing to work within the system.
Right.
They wanted a more confrontational approach, a more radical break from the status quo.
And of course, there was Malcolm X, who offered a starkly different vision for black liberation.
Malcolm X was a powerful voice for black empowerment and self-determination.
Yeah.
He rejected integration and called for black people to control their own communities and their own destinies.
Their relationship was definitely complex, a mix of respect and rivalry.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how their paths seem to converge towards the end of their lives.
Yeah, it is fascinating. They both began to broaden their focus, recognizing the interconnectedness of racial and economic justice.
Right. MLK's move north to Chicago,
Right.
his focus on poverty and inequality, and his growing criticism of the Vietnam War all pointed towards a more radical vision for social change.
And Malcolm X, after his pilgrimage to Mecca, seemed to soften his stance on integration, even acknowledging the possibility of working with white allies.
Right.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if they had more time to develop their ideas and work together.
It's a tragedy that their lives were cut short, but their legacies continue to inspire us to this day.
They do. Their different approaches to the fight for racial justice remind us that there are many paths to achieving equality. And it's a reminder that those paths can evolve over time as we learn from each other, from our experiences.
Okay, so we've delved into MLK's personal life, his leadership style, and the complexities of the movement. But there's one more crucial aspect of his story we need to explore:
Okay.
the FBI's relentless surveillance and harassment.
Yeah, that's a dark chapter that often gets overlooked. But it's crucial to understanding the forces MLK was up against.
J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were obsessed with discrediting him,
They were.
seeing him as a threat to national security.
It's crazy to think that the FBI, an organization tasked with upholding the law, would be so focused on trying to destroy a man who is simply advocating for equality and justice. It's a chilling reminder that those in power often use their authority to protect the status quo, even when that status quo is based on injustice and inequality.
And in the case of the FBI, they used their vast resources to spy on, harass, and try to silence MLK.
It's hard to fathom that level of paranoia and suspicion.
Yeah, what was it about MLK that Hoover found so threatening?
Well, Hoover, built his career on a very particular vision of America, one where dissent and social change were often seen as threats to national security. He saw a communist lurking behind every corner, and the civil rights movement, especially its more radical elements, was often lumped into that category.
But MLK was advocating for peaceful change rooted in American values of equality and justice.
Right.
How could Hoover perceive that as a threat?
Well, that's the key question. You see, to Hoover, MLK's calls for racial and economic justice were deeply unsettling. He saw them as challenges to the established social order, a threat to white supremacy, and he was determined to use the power of the FBI to neutralize that perceived threat.
And he did that through surveillance. I mean, what exactly did the FBI do to try and discredit MLK?
Well, they used a wide range of tactics, some legal, some not.
Yeah?
They tapped his phones, bugged his hotel rooms, even tried to infiltrate his inner circle by planting informants.
Wow, the sheer scale of the operation is mind-boggling. It makes you wonder how MLK was able to function under that kind of constant scrutiny.
It speaks to his strength and resilience, his unwavering commitment to his cause. But it also reveals a darker truth about how power is often used to silence dissent, especially when it comes from marginalized communities.
It wasn't just about gathering information, was it? I mean, they were actively trying to smear his reputation and undermine his leadership.
Oh, absolutely. They spread rumors about his personal life, magnified his flaws, and tried to paint him as a dangerous radical, hoping to turn public opinion against him.
Wasn't there that infamous anonymous letter the FBI sent to MLK? The one threatening to expose his alleged affairs and urging him to commit suicide?
Yeah, that letter is a chilling example of the FBI's tactics. It's a deeply disturbing document that reveals the depths of their desperation to silence him.
It's a horrifying chapter in American history to think that an organization tasked with upholding the law would resort to such underhanded tactics is truly shocking.
It's a stark reminder that even in a democracy, those who challenge the status quo, especially those fighting for racial justice, often face powerful forces determined to silence them.
And all of this was happening while MLK was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, leading marches, delivering some of the most powerful speeches of the 20th century.
It's a powerful contrast, isn't it? On one hand, you have this global recognition of his commitment to peace and justice, and on the other hand, you have this relentless campaign to destroy his reputation.
It's almost Shakespearean in its tragedy.
It really is. His life was a constant struggle against overwhelming odds, a testament to his courage and perseverance in the face of injustice.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive into the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. What does it all mean? What are the key takeaways for us today?
Well, I think his story teaches us about the power of courage, the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, even when you're facing powerful forces determined to silence you.
It also reminds us that the fight for social justice is never easy. It requires persistent strategy and a willingness to challenge both those in power and those within our own communities who may be resistant to change.
And perhaps most importantly, MLK's story reminds us that even the most iconic figures are human.
Right.
They have flaws and make mistakes.
Yeah.
But those imperfections don't diminish their impact. In fact, they often make them even more relatable and inspiring.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. What part of MLK's journey resonates most strongly with you? How can we apply his lessons to the challenges we face today? What can we do to create a more just and equitable world?
Those are important questions for all of us to consider.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr.